All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our third presentation of our weekend with Creation Ministries International and with our guest speaker, Jim Hughes. Some of you were here this morning, and I know that you enjoyed it, and I know that you will receive a special blessing as well for this afternoon, two presentations. We have one starting right now in a few minutes. After I pray, we'll start a presentation, and then we will have a break after the first presentation. It's going to be about an hour-long presentation. Then we'll have a break, 10 or so minutes. Then we'll have the second one, and after the second one, we'll have a question and answer period for 15, 20 minutes. Then you'll have the chance to get some, to look at some resources and buy some resources afterwards. So I thank you for being here. I know that it's hard to make it home and eat lunch and come back, and for some of you, but whoever is here, and we'll just start, and everybody else will just come. So let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll just go straight into our presentation. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your blessings. Thank you for the blessing of the Sabbath day. I thank you for our guest speaker this weekend, for Jim, and for his passion to present biblical creation, Lord. There is a lot of attacks on biblical creation these days, but we know that you have revealed in your word that we need to stand on the principles of the Bible. And I thank you for Jim and Creation Ministries International, that they are preaching the truth from the Word of God. So, Lord, as we're going into our third presentation this afternoon, I pray a special blessing on him. Please descend with your Holy Spirit upon him and give him the right words, and that people that are here today and those who are watching live will receive a special blessing. We pray all these things in the name of Jesus. Amen. Jim? It's all yours.
So welcome again for those of you who are here this morning. When you see the media talking about evolution, it's often presented as if it's a fact and you're an absolute fool if you don't believe it. For example, Ernst Mayr, who was a prominent evolutionist, he says, no educated person any longer questions the validity of the so-called theory of evolution, which we now know to be a simple fact. Likewise, most of Darwin's particular theses have been fully confirmed, such as that of common descent, the gradualism of evolution, and the explanatory of theory of natural selection. So here is a clear statement from an evolutionist that we're to accept it. It is fact, and that's the way it is. So, another claim here, such claims that evolution is a fact. This was written by Michael Denton, and he is not a Christian, just to put this into context. He counters this. He says such claims that evolution is a fact no longer needing proof are simply nonsense. For Darwin's model of evolution is still very much a theory and still very much in doubt when it comes to macroevolutionary phenomena. Furthermore, being basically a theory of historical reconstruction, it's impossible to verify by experiment or direct observation, as is normal in science. And he makes a key point there, Michael Denton. If the evolution from molecules to man if it occurred at all, it has occurred in the distant past, because after 50 years of attempting to see it in the laboratory, they haven't seen it, and it isn't observable today. And so the conflict that we're talking about here is not a conflict between science and religion, or science and Christianity, if you want to put it that way. No, it's a conflict between two views of interpreting history, of what happened in the past. And so keep this in mind. It's not science versus creationism. It's two views of what happened in the past. And evolution is simply not derived from the evidence that's available today. It is imposed on the evidence. I mentioned this this morning, and how many weren't here this morning or didn't hear this morning? There were a few of you. Okay, I will take the time then to define evolution. The idea is that, and Ernst Mayr said this, but it comes from an original single cell, all the variety of life that we see around us. And genetic information has been increasing through time. I mentioned that the simplest cell that we know of today that can reproduce itself has maybe roughly 480 genes, and that's what it takes to make an entity that can reproduce itself, whereas the human genome has about 30,000 genes. So somewhere along the line in the theory of evolution, the idea is information has been increasing through time. At the top are all the species we see around us. Some species have died out, whether they died out in the flood or died out since the flood and gone extinct. That's the ones that haven't made it to the top of the tree. And then there are the missing links on the branches. And so Lynn Margulis, another prominent evolutionist, she said every form of life on Earth, oak tree and elephant, bird, and bacterium, shares a common ancestry with every other form of life. And so plants, animals, and humans have all come from that original cell. That's the definition of evolution. So what difference does it make? Somebody could say, well, I believe in Jesus. Isn't that all I need? Maybe God used evolution as the means whereby he created the variety of life that we see. So why should we care about this? Why is this an important topic? So one reason is because God states that he created plants and animals by their kinds. He didn't create them from pre-existing entities. And the writer of Hebrews reinforces that in Hebrews 11:3. Another reason we should be concerned about understanding this is that mankind is presented as a unique creation. We read one account of the creation in Genesis 1, and then it's expanded in Genesis 2. And we see how God formed the body of Adam out of the dust of the earth, and he breathed a spirit life into that as a unique creation. And it wasn't that somewhere along the line a hominoid creature was endowed with rationality. The Bible presents it quite differently. But if mankind is a product of evolution, well, then what happens to Genesis 1? Genesis 1 can no longer be taken as a historical account. It is only a story. And if it's a story, then why should we take Genesis 6 and 8 to 8, the account of the flood, as having any reliability? And for that matter, why bother to believe in Abraham? And if we don't believe in Abraham, why believe in David? And if we don't believe in David, why believe in Christ? It's that simple. If any part of the Bible fails, the whole Bible fails. And we as thinking people should desire to know the truth. We should want to know what the truth is and how it's supported by evidence. I pointed out in one of the presentations this morning that 170 years of evolutionary thought is one of the major contributing factors to the immorality, rampant immorality we see around us today. And one of the primary reasons why we should care about this, and we really need to question evolution, is it's not accepted on evidence. And I'm going to show this to you. It is accepted because men want to believe anything other than that God is a creator. It really comes down to that. That's the reason why we should do it. And in the end, evolution is a form of idolatry. It's worshiping the creature rather than the creator. So let's look at this in a little more detail. Many times the opponents of God's special creation, they claim that what we believe in is that God created all the species. In fact, you'll hear people say, well, how did Noah take all the species into the ark? No, we don't believe that God created all the species. That is false, and some of those species have gone extinct. What God created was kinds, and the kinds in our modern taxonomy may represent the family level in our modern taxonomies. They may, above the species level. They certainly are. And in that kind, there's a broad spectrum of genetic information, and those kinds have adapted through natural selection, yes, we accept natural selection, also through artificial selection, where humans do breeding, and they have diversified into different ecological niches, and that is where the species have come from. So the modern species are the result of developments out of the genome that's available at that. And so there have been, since the flood, there have been points where there have been explosions of speciation. I'll give you an example. After a hurricane in the Caribbean, it might wipe out a huge amount of the life there. And so let's say the lizards are destroyed. And this is actually one of the good examples. There's real literature on the lizards that are destroyed on the island. After a while, some lizards make it to the island again. They float on water, plant rafts or something. They make it to the island. And all of a sudden, there's an explosion of species that appear because they go into different niches. So those migratory lizards take advantage of the availability of an island where there's no competition for their niches, and then they explode into that. And that happens over and over again in biological development. So species form from a broader genetic availability of information. But one of the things that you need to realize is when a species is isolated from the population, it loses genetic information. So take this as an animal kind that Noah would have had in the ark, and out of that, different species have developed from domestic cats. By the way, that's our cat. He thinks he owns the place in the middle. Now, you cannot breed a lion and a domestic cat. It doesn't work. However, there is basically a chain of breeding, like lions and tigers can interbreed, and you can work your way down the chain. And domestic cats can interbreed with lynxes and bobcats, for example. Doesn't necessarily produce a fertile offspring. But so there is this continuous network within the kind, but they have diversified to such an extent that they've lost the ability to interbreed now, and they have less genetic information because they have been isolated. And genetic diversity has actually declined, and there's been a loss of information. And I used this illustration this morning that when you breed dogs, that's not natural selection, it's human selection of the breeds. The breeds actually become less robust over time. And if you inbreed too much, they explode. And I mentioned that probably the most, if you want a really robust dog, you want a mutt, because you bring all of the different gene threads back together. I had a friend who raised Great Danes, and they have a very short life expectancy relative to some other dogs because they have a heart condition, and so they don't survive very long. So this is the result of losing robustness in their genes. But even after 3,000 years of selective and extreme selective breeding made by humans, these are still dogs. They haven't changed from being dogs. So the mechanism that evolutionists need for, in their theory, to be successful is described here. The developing research area on how the vast biodiversity on Earth evolves accepts natural selection, and we creationists accept natural selection, by the way. That's not a problem, and I'll show you that in a minute. And 3 other established forces of evolution as its basis. These include mutation, random genetic drift, and gene flow. Now, I am not going to get into random genetic drift and gene flow today. That's too technical for this. I'm just going to deal with natural selection and mutation because those are the 2 primary supposed engines of evolution. So let's look at natural selection. So you have an initial canine kind, we'll say it's a dog, So it's a species within the canine kind. And it has a fairly broad spectrum of genetic information available to it. And it has in its genes, genes for long hair and genes for short hair. Picture that, right? A mother dog would give birth to pups. Some of them would have short hair and some long hair. So she has the genetic information for long hair and short hair. And then what happened, and you can see I'm using L for long and S for short. And by the way, this is a caricature because often fur length is not usually associated with a single gene. There's multiple genes that contribute. Studies have been done. For instance, human skin color, there's at least 2 genes that interact, and they're quite a bit apart, and they interact for human skin color. So you can't find a single gene necessarily that deals with fur length. But keep it simple. So they have offsprings that can have a mix. For example, that one of their offspring, when you have both male and female dogs that have long and short genes, and the 2 sets of chromosomes come together, they can give birth to mix both genes, or some of them will have only long hair genes, and some will have only short hair genes. And so let's take the example that they give birth to those, and they're in a very cold climate during the Ice Age, for example, in the northern regions. And the long-furred dogs survive the best. And they give birth to, because they only have the long hair gene, they give birth to only dogs with long hair. And over time, there's no more short hair genes available in that population pool. Now, there's still dogs, and they could breed with another type breed of dogs, and the genes could be reintroduced. So the canines have adapted through natural selection to their environment, but they have lost genetic information because the original pair had the genes for long hair and short hair. The one that is adapted to the cold climate and survived the best has only the genes for the long hair. And so information is lost when small breeding populations are isolated from the larger pool of genetic information. And this is exactly the opposite of what the evolutionists need, which is microbes to man. You need increasing genetic information, added genetic information. You don't need the loss of genetic information. And so this isn't evolution. Natural selection doesn't support evolution. It's taking already existing genetic information, and the animals or plants are more adaptive that have certain genes, and then if they're in an isolated breeding pool, they lose genetic information. Let me just, so that you can understand a little bit about what I mean by isolated breeding pools. My wife is from Puerto Rico, and there are certain peppers that have a bit of a spice to them, which we can't get in the supermarkets. Not surprising. And so she and one of my sons, they got the seeds of a particular type of pepper that we wanted to grow this summer. My son Andrew, he grew them in his garden. My wife grew them in a flower box on the porch. So they were isolated, and they produced the same seeds the next time. But Andrew grew them along with other peppers in his garden. And unfortunately, they cross-pollinated. They introduced other genes into it. And so none of the peppers, you can't grow the same peppers again from the seeds because the genes have mixed. They're no longer specialized. Whereas the ones my wife grew on our porch, there were no other peppers growing anywhere nearby, and they've kept their limited gene. Do you follow that? So when you have an isolated population, you lose genetic information. When you have a large population, there's constant mixing, and you get the genes available. So over time, the long-furred canines are less able to adapt, because if you take those ones that have adapted for the northern climate and you take them down to the Sahara Desert, they're always hot because they got too much fur. And so they're not as adaptable as the Maine dog, which supports both. So the main source of variation that creates species is there's a huge spectrum of genetic information available in most original breeding pairs. In plants, for example, orchids, huge variety in orchids. In the brassicas in plants, all kinds of variety. You think of Brussels sprouts and cauliflower and broccoli, they're all in the brassica family. So there's a big genetic diversity available, or dogs as an example. So in the original equine kind, there are these primary species that have come out. There may be some others, but within these species, there are breeds. I think there's about 700 breeds of horses, if I recall correctly, within the horse species. And these can interbreed, not necessarily successfully producing offspring that can then breed, because they have lost genetic information. So when you breed a horse and a donkey, depending on whether the male horse or female horse, you either get a mule or a hinny, and they are not fertile when you bring them back together because there's been a loss of genetic information over time. Here's where you get an example of the wide spectrum of genetic possibilities in the human genome. Two sets of twins, and this couple, and they're quite colorful. And here are twins that are born, well, came out of the same womb at the same time. And they are, there's quite a spectrum there. And so after the animals came out of the ark, and after the Tower of Babel, the animals started to spread around the new forming continents and around the world, and they became isolated breeding populations. And one of the reasons the isolation occurred was with the Ice Age that developed very quickly after the flood. It created ice barriers that separated breeding populations, and as they went on to islands, and those islands were separated, they became isolated breeding populations, and they didn't interbreed, and over time they lost the genetic information. And similarly, man was driven out. But there's been constant mixing of genes throughout the ages through conquest and wars and all those kinds of things. So human genome is much more continuous than some of the animal genomes are. So when you get a species like this fish, the variety of them, the salmon that can go into different niches. Some can go into only salt water, some can go into mix of salt and fresh water, some you find only in fresh water. And this is all available within the salmon genes, and they can specialize into different niches. But there are limits. Salmon don't evolve into catfish or goldfish. There are limits within the spectrum of the gene. But so evolutionists realize this, that what they need is a second mechanism, at least a second mechanism, because natural selection only works on what's available already in the gene. It doesn't give information, it subtracts information. So what they then turn to is that they turn to mutations. But let's take an example. You've probably heard, well, even the SARS-CoV is mutating. You've heard that expression? Like the Delta variant is a mutation. So they turn to mutations as the source of genetic information. So they claim that drug resistance in bacteria is an example of evolution. That's their claim. So and this is taken from UC Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley website. And you'll notice that on the left-hand panel, there's a mix of bacteria there, and the orange one is antibiotic resistant. But it's in the pool already. And then what happens is when they inject the antibiotic in, it kills most of the blue ones, and the ones that survive are the antibiotic-resistant ones. And over time, that's all that's left. As long as the antibiotic remains there, and eventually all of the non-resistant ones are gone, and you've lost genetic information because you don't have the other form. But I want you to notice something that they do here. They talk about it as evolving into the resistant strain. Do you see that? That's not evolution. There's no additional genetic information being added. It's lost its genetic information. This is a constant bait and switch technique that's used in it. No new genetic information. The genetic information was already there. That antibiotic-resistant one was in the natural pool. In fact, I'll come to it in a second when I said the fact that I was thinking I had one slide here, but Michigan State University conducted a study on E. coli bacteria, and they ran it through 67,000 generations. They tried various paths. They would use antibiotics, and take through different paths, and they found the same mutations occurring at various times. But after 67,000 generations, it was still E. coli bacteria. Nothing had added. No new genetic information was added. All that happened was that they, at times, depending on what they did to them, injecting antibiotics, they lost genetic information. Never did they increase their genetic information. Now, 67,000 generations with a fairly simple genome. And they're telling us that humans evolved all of this complexity from a pre-hominoid creature in maybe, less than 1,000 generations? And with all of the complexity in the human genome? But antibiotic resistance in bacteria has always been around, at least since Adam's sin. So at the Franklin expedition, that around the turn of the, was it the 20th century? Yeah, the turn of the 20th century, that they, or late 19th century, they went to the Antarctica and they died. They got frozen in the ship and they couldn't escape and they ended up dying. And they found them eventually, and they found the antibiotic resistance in those men. So it wasn't evolving from antibiotics, because antibiotics weren't developed for another 70 years or something. And similarly, when you look at isolated tribes that have never had modern medicine, and you take a stool sample from them, and you look at the E. coli or whatever bacteria you're interested in, you find that they're antibiotic resistant. Similarly, when they did it on a soldier that had died during the First World War, and they had a stool sample in the laboratory, and they found the antibiotic resistance there. Bacteria. So they've always been around. It's just that the other bacteria survive better. And so what happens with mutations? Mutations do two things. The main thing they do is a loss of information, or they may have flipped some switches and there's no loss of information, but it's changed some of the nucleotides in the DNA. So it's like a spelling mistake, but the gene can still work, because you can read a sentence with a spelling mistake in it. In fact, you can read a sentence with a lot of spelling mistakes in it. Well, DNA has a lot of error correction techniques, and because we have two sets of chromosomes, if the mother's set is different than the husband's set, you may not get the genetic disease, because you may get the proteins being developed out of the other set of chromosomes. And so, but mutations occur, mostly it's information loss, occasionally it's a substitute. And there are other things that I'm not going to go into, but gene insertion and duplication and rearrangement, but none of this is adding new information. It's already taking information and shuffling it around. Because they say, well, look, bacteria can take DNA from other bacteria, but where did that initially DNA come from? They're just sharing DNA, and yes, that can happen. That's insertion. So here is an example. A red cardinal is a natural color. Do you have cardinals here in Alberta? We see quite a few of them. In fact, they're still around in Toronto. They haven't headed south yet. But occasionally, you'll get a mutation, and it's the loss of the ability to produce the red pigments. And you get this nice yellow bird. But if they're in an isolated breeding population, the yellow may come to predominate. If they're in a general pool, often the mutations will get bred out because they will breed with others that have the broader spectrum. And so, but it's an information loss. This mutation is the inability to produce the red pigment. I mentioned this tea this morning that has been discovered growing in the province, in a province in China, and it's caffeine-free. And this tea, notice that it's lost the ability to produce the caffeine synthase enzyme. And the caffeine synthase enzyme appears in chocolate and in coffee and various other substances. It's not just in tea. And the caffeine synthase enzyme produces the caffeine, and the caffeine is an insecticide that protects the plant. And I mentioned that this morning, if you're drinking any caffeinated drink, you're drinking a pesticide. So, but notice what the article in The Economist says. It's lost the ability to produce this enzyme, but it's made its evolutionary journey toward being caffeine-free. Here it is, bait and switch again. This isn't adding information. This is losing information, losing robustness, and they're calling it evolution. Do you follow that? This is what's happening here. Here's another example. Findings which were published in whatever, this evolutionary biology, BMC. The black squirrel is actually a gray squirrel with a faulty pigment gene. And it's carried over from the fox squirrel and so on. So when I look out our window, I see all these black and gray squirrels running around, but this is one that has a genetic defect, and it's lost the ability to do it. Now, there's a county north of London, Ontario, where there are white squirrels. They are not albinos. They are white squirrels. And it's interesting that this is another genetic defect from the gray squirrel. And the only reason these squirrels survive is because they're protected by law and humans are taking care of them. It's quite cool in Exeter that they have these white squirrels. But what would happen if they weren't being protected by humans? Think about it. Hawks would spot them instantly, wouldn't they? On the green leaves and on the grass, and you can be sure that they would be snapped up very fast. So this defect would generally be bred out of the population because they would be killed. But because they're protected and people are taking care of them, it's artificial protection in this case. And going back to that tea example, if humans start to cultivate it so that we can have naturally decaffeinated tea, it'll take humans to protect them. They'll have to use other pesticides to protect them because they don't have natural protection. And so we will have to take care of them on that. But this is what mutations generally do. They're detrimental. Cystic fibrosis is an example. Are any of you lactose tolerant? If you are, you actually have a result of a genetic mutation, and it's a defect in your genes. That's, now, not all lactose intolerance. There's also environmental causes sometimes, but it is a genetic defect. And I mentioned previously that there are approximately 6,000 genetic diseases in the human population. So even if a 1 in a million beneficial mutation were to occur, the likelihood of it being positively selected and improving the species is infinitesimally small, because overwhelmingly mutations are negative or benign. But if the one were to occur, they would be bred out. So I would argue that all mutations are harmful. Now, this is from Nature's magazine on their website. And you can go through, read page after page after page on, I suppose if you print it out, it'd be a lot of paper, about the detail on mutations. And there's only one example mentioned in passing on this website, which is supposedly a beneficial mutation, and they mention sickle cell anemia. It is claimed that this is a positive mutation. But before I go to sickle cell anemia, I just want to read you at the very bottom of this website. In fact, I think this is the very last sentence or two. It says, together these different classes of mutations and their causes serve to place organisms at risk. Overwhelmingly, the mutations are negative, at risk for disease, and to provide the raw material for evolution. Now watch what they do here. Thus, the mutations are often detrimental to individuals, but they serve to diversify the overall population. So what they're telling you is things that are bad for people, the individuals that kill them, are good for the population as a whole. But there's not a single shred of evidence given on that website. You go and look. There's nothing that supports that statement. It's one of these things, well, we must have beneficial mutations because we see all this variety of life around us. And so they've jumped to a conclusion that is unsupported by a stitch of evidence. So let's look at sickle cell anemia for just a second, because it's the only one that's ever mentioned by evolution as supposedly being a beneficial mutation. It does provide some immunity to malaria, but it's at a very high cost. 25% of the children born who are carriers of this die. That's a pretty high death rate. And are we going to declare a mutation that kills 25% of the children as being a beneficial mutation? But it does provide some immunity to malaria. And what it is it causes it so that the blood cannot carry the oxygen effectively. A good mutation would not impede oxygen distribution in the body. So here's an interesting one. I'm sure we've all heard of this particular SARS-CoV-2 virus. And this was in Popular Science in March of 2020. And they say SARS-CoV-2 is changing at the rate scientists would expect for a coronavirus. It's mutating. Robert Carter, one of our geneticists, in an article he's written on our website, he has predicted that SARS-CoV-2 is going to mutate so much that within about 2 years, it's going to have no damage. It won't have any more damage. Viruses eventually decay. Now, new ones keep coming along, but eventually they decay. And so the mutations here. But Popular Science is telling us that they are mutating, and notice what it says. The bulk of the mutations that appear as a virus spreads are either harmful to the virus itself, meaning it is less likely to survive or replicate, or they don't change how it functions. So we can be happy to hear the SARS-CoV-2 is going to mutate out of effectiveness over time. Right? That's right out of the article back in March last year. You can see the spike proteins there on the outside of the virus, right? So evolutionists speak out of both sides of their mouths. It's contradictory here, because from Popular Science viewpoint, mutations which are deleterious are a good thing, because we want SARS-CoV-2 to disappear, mutate out. But let's look at genetically modified foods. They do not produce viable offspring. Now, there's people who are against GMO, but most of us probably eat GMO corn, hybrid corn. It basically was grown in Canada because it gives the best yields and needs less fertilizer and so on, but it doesn't grow true. When you plant a hybrid corn, it won't produce the same one that you had before. And so this is genetically modified, but they are less viable than the natural products. Here's an example. The results to date have been reassuring with regard to GMO, that in the genetically altered organisms have proved to be less viable than their wild-type counterparts, and hence unable to affect existing ecosystems substantially. So they're saying that when the mutations occur, they make these organisms less viable. And so if human-directed genetic changes make an entity less viable, unless it's being protected by humans, for example, with fertilizers and pesticides and so on, under what conditions would random genetic changes make the entity more viable? So mutations are always detrimental, or at best they are neutral. There is, other than the sickle cell anemia one, no evolution has ever presented an example of a beneficial mutation. Here's a bacteria that causes stomach ulcers, and it's antibiotic resistant at times because it's lost the ability to produce an enzyme. Here's another bacteria which I'm sure you heard of. It's what causes tuberculosis, and when it becomes antibiotic resistant, it's the ones that have lost, or they actually have an enzyme overproduction, and it weakens the bacteria overall. Negative, negative, negative is what we see on these mutations. Here's another example. Genetically altered mosquitoes are less fertile and less healthy than mosquitoes that have not been altered. Mutations, mutations, mutations are negative. And yet these are supposed to be the engine for creating new information. No, never has it been shown, never, that new information is being created. It's a loss of information or a reshuffling of information. And the basic question you have to ask is, okay, there's this genetic information. How did it get there in the first place? Genes don't just suddenly pop into existence. They are complex strings of nucleotides that are built up, and they have a lot of information into them. Every mutation is harmful and causes all kinds of defects. And there's been no example ever of microbes to man evolution taking place beyond, at the very, nothing beyond the family level. Variety occurs within the family level, but never beyond that. Nothing has ever gone beyond. And the family may or may not correspond to the kinds, the biblical kinds. In some cases, it might be the species, or it might be between them. But here's an interesting example. These have been isolated breeding populations, llamas and camels, and yet you can interbreed them. So they were originally from a common kind, and they actually do produce fertile offspring. The camas, they'd be actually kind of cute, wouldn't they? But they can produce fertile offspring. So they're not as, even though South America and Asia, they're not as isolated genetically, and they haven't been separated for millions of years, only since the flood. And they still have enough of the overlap in the genetic information that you can breed them. But never has there been a cross-family or cross-kind example demonstrated. And there's no evidence of this type of change, never demonstrated in observational science. Now, I haven't gotten into a lot of detail here at the genetic level, but if you want to explore the building up of what it takes to get to DNA in a cell, a fantastic book that came out last year is called The Stairway to Life. Now, we do happen to carry it on our website, and you can buy it on Amazon or wherever. And it is absolutely mind-blowing. I was speaking in Edmonton at Birch Bay Ranch a year ago, and I read the book on the plane on the flight out, and I just was blown away with it. And I started to reread it when I was flying to Winnipeg last month, and I hadn't quite finished it, so on my flight out to Edmonton, I was reading some of it. I'm reading something else as well, so I was switching back and forth. But notice what it says. From recently acquired insights into the complexity of the simplest organism, Tan and Stadler specify requirements for spontaneous formation of life and evaluate the prospects for natural processes to satisfy these requirements. These two, Tan and Stadler, have amazing academic credentials. They are research scientists. They really know their subject. And the conclusion they come to, there's nothing in this book that's theological per se. It's just science. And they're just saying it's impossible, absolutely impossible, to have the components building up to get to DNA in cells. So let's just talk then. I'm not going to go in. If you want to explore the chemical evolution before we have biological evolution, just read that book. But if you want to take it from there, no matter how much you say that these chemical evolution doesn't occur, evolution still insists that it happens. And so one of the ways they propose, because DNA and RNA will destruct very quickly in a water environment, so it couldn't have formed in water, and you need, well, the irony is you need a cell to manufacture DNA, but you need DNA in order for the cell to know what to manufacture. So how it all comes together. But they're trying to come up with a way to have DNA come into existence, and they've suggested one approach is it formed in a clay infrastructure. Another is that molecules have arrived from space. And it actually is given the name interstellar transpermia. They actually have a name for this, but molecules have arrived from space. So, but evolutionists admit that they have no clue how DNA formed. For example, Stephen Hawking. I'm sure you've heard of Stephen Hawking. He had Lou Gehrig's disease, and he's claimed to be this great physicist. And I've read his, well, at least a brief history of time, and I don't find anything in there that's particularly illuminating. But somehow, he says, some atoms came to be arranged in the form of molecules of DNA. We do not know how DNA molecules first appeared. The chances against the DNA molecule arising by random fluctuations are very small. So he admits they don't know, and it's essentially impossible. But somehow it happened. And so he speculates that since we're here, it must have happened, because they won't accept special creation. Here's another example from Scientific American. Unfortunately, there are not enough data to prove or rule out any of these theories, like the mineral structures or molecules from space. When it comes to the origin and early evolution of life, some mysteries seem as intractable as ever. They don't know how DNA could have formed. And they've just outright dismissed the idea that God could have created. And the article concludes, with faith and optimism, that a natural explanation is going to be found. I used this example this morning, but I have to use it again because it's so powerful. Even if we had the basic nucleotides that are strung together to make DNA, even if they could spontaneously form, it's the stringing them together, and the human genome has 3 billion nucleotides. How we're going to string those together. It's not the hardware that's a problem, although it's an impossible thing for it to spontaneously come into existence. It's the software, the information that's built into the DNA That's the problem. And Paul Davies says, how did nature fabricate the world's first digital information processor? The original living cell from the blind chaos of blundering molecules. How did molecular hardware get to write its own software? I'm a computer programmer. I write Java code, and I've written recently some very sophisticated Java code. And I was thinking in one of my presentations of giving an example. If I just change one semicolon in my program, it blows up. So it's very hard to believe that in DNA, if we don't start mutations, that they're not going to cause damage. Now, God has built all kinds of error correction utilities into DNA. So the complexity of DNA is mind-boggling. Does anybody know what a palindrome is? Do you know what a palindrome is? It's a sentence that can be read in both directions. Madam, I'm Adam. That's what Adam said to Eve when he was introduced. Madam, I'm Adam. That's a palindrome. A more sophisticated one that Napoleon had to voice was, Abel was I ere I saw Elba. Abel was I ere I saw Elba. These are palindromes. I don't know if you're aware, but DNA, remember this is 3 billion nucleotides. DNA can be read in both directions. And it can have different instruction sets. You can start in different places in the DNA and produce different RNA to produce different proteins. You can take different genes working together. There are switches built into what used to be called junk DNA, but now they realize it's regulatory DNA between the genes, and it turns on and off functions. Did I use this example this morning? I can't remember, but epigenetic information is also passed in to cells. And an example is that a woman who is bearing an embryo at high altitudes, the atmospheric pressure information is fed into the developing embryo, and that child is going to have larger lung capacity. That's mind-boggling when you think about it. The DNA can get these signals coming in from outside, and I think I've used this one. I think I used this one this morning. When you cut yourself, no, that's better for cells working together. I won't do that right now. So anything that declares made by God is its DNA. So nevertheless, evolutionists know that DNA, they can't explain how it arrived, but they believe that it must have, and so random chance is going to give them their answer. The Original Life Science Foundation offered a $1 million prize to anyone proposing a highly plausible natural process or mechanism for how spontaneously genetic information would come into existence. You'd think a $1 million incentive would be significant. Well, after 13 years, it had never been paid out, and they canceled it. So nobody was willing to step up and say, here's a plausible explanation for how this, even though they could have earned $1 million. Darwin talks about in his book about complex processes, and he says if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modification, my theory would absolutely break down. Well, the Bible tells us that animals were created in mature form. At the molecular level, Michael Behe has shown that there are all kinds of complex machines inside of cells. This is a bacterial flagellum, and it's a motor that spins a propeller. And he argues in there with these components that you can't make them from slight modifications. The whole thing has to be there, all the parts, or it won't work. And he says in his book, Darwin's Black Box, I'm not recommending you buy these books, by the way. Behe is a theistic evolutionist, and he believes in deep time. But what he talks about in micro machines is mind-blowing. but I'm not recommending you get these books. If you search the science literature on evolution, and if you focus your search on the question of how molecular machines, the basis of life inside of the cells they develop, you will find an eerie and complete silence. The complexity of life's foundation has paralyzed science's attempt to account for it. Now, 21 years later, and this is in 2019, he brought out a sequel called Darwin Devolves. And he says the boosters of Darwinism support a theory that labors mightily to explain a crummy 2-amino acid residue disulfide bond, but cannot account for more complex structures. Darwinian mechanism is self-limiting, capable only of eliminating or modifying pre-existing molecular systems. This is the molecular level, and I've been telling you the same thing, mutations at the genetic level. Incapable of building functionally complex structures. If we come up from the biochemical and the biological level of DNA, how do the nucleus of a cell, how did the nucleus that produces the information for proteins, how did that get a nucleus? And then the simplest cell has 482 genes and is vastly more complex than all the components that go into making an automobile, including the software. And how did multicellular entities come? And this is where I use the example of a scratch. Because when you get a scratch and it starts bleeding, the blood begins to coagulate, and the cells talk to one another. They communicate to one another because the cell says, okay, hold on, I'm going to start to seal this and coagulate it. And then once it's coagulated, it now says, okay, I've stopped the bleeding. Now you can start building skin cells again and fill in the wound with skin cells. And then it sheds the scab and so on. Those are cells talking to one another, working together in that component. Taking it up a level, I mentioned that with bisexual reproduction, you get 2 sets of chromosomes, one from the male and one from the female. How did cells learn to take 2 sets of chromosomes and cooperate with them? Scientific American has an article that proposes a theory for how the Y chromosomes were developed, because males have a Y chromosome, females only have 2 X chromosomes. Male have an X and a Y, females have only X chromosomes. So how did this develop? And the article in Scientific American uses words like probably, deduce, seem, and apparently, but it's storytelling. They're not showing observational science. It's all a hypothesis for how it could have developed. And even if a viable life form that had, say, female plumbing were to arrive, at the exact same time, somewhere spontaneously, a male entity would have to arrive with all of the plumbing and and sharing the chromosome sets. This all would have had to have taken place, same time, same place, by chance. Take it up a level here. Convergence is something evolutionists can't explain. Life has supposedly evolved in various different, flight has evolved in various different forms of life. Convergence in eyes. Humans and octopuses and squids have very similar eyes. But the common ancestor that we're supposed to come from had a completely different kind of eye. Hemoglobin is an amazing substance, and it's a complex protein, and it carries oxygen. And yet, it is found in different places in animals, not necessarily in common ancestors, and it's even found in some plants. And how on earth could this complex protein have developed spontaneously multiple times? Well, God used the hemoglobin design multiple times. Another problem for evolution is what's called species stasis. And that is basically that animals don't change into something else. You can breed fruit flies for generation after generation after generation. You can inject things into their environment. They might lose their ability to fly, and they end up having their antennas coming out of their hips and all kinds of weird things, but they never evolve into anything other than fruit flies. They're always fruit flies, species stasis. Take it up a level to symbiotic relationships. This is what's called a Tasmanian snow skink, and there's the honey bush. When the honey bush is ready to be pollinated, it's got a hard casing on it that only the Tasmanian snow skink opens up so it can be pollinated. And one article said, why did the honey bush evolve such a complicated procedure for its pollination? Hold on a second. Honey bushes don't think. Am I running out of time here? Whoa. Okay. Honey bushes don't think and decide to evolve. It was a random chance. I used this example this morning, so I'm going to skip it. Sociobiology is another problem for biologists because they claim, if you read the literature, everything is a result of our genes. And there's been a book advocating that actually rape is a result of our genes and that rape has a biological purpose. Can you fathom that? And the problem is that if everything is the result of evolution, then all deviances. Look at this article. Prejudices is the result of evolution. So if you're prejudiced, that's okay because it's your evolutionary path. So everything is natural according to evolution. So what evidence exists for evolution? Zero. None. Zilch. Not a single thread of empirical evidence. Nothing supports the claim. Evolution is a theory universally accepted not because it can be proven by logically coherent evidence to be true, but because the only alternative is special creation, is clearly incredible. It's a theory without an empirical foundation, and therefore it is not science. And they have this tendency to rationalize. So why is it so universally accepted? It's because men suppress the truth. Romans 1:18. Most biologists accept evolution as though it were a proven fact, although this conviction rests upon circumstantial evidence. It forms a satisfactory faith on which to base our interpretation of nature. So evolution is believed because it is the main prop for a faith, a religion without God. In fact, this quote here says, the reason we accept evolution is because we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. So, after these presentations, later today, there's a book table over there, and we have various resources. Genetic entropy is a powerful one. Creation.com, if you want, on our website. We have all kinds of good material. We have Evolution's Achilles Heel and an accompanying DVD. Creatures do change, natural selection, but it's not evolution. We also have Creation Magazine, which you can subscribe to, and lots of articles in there. And if you subscribe today, I'll give you a free copy of it and a DVD. The Faith Building Pack is a book for Christianity for Skeptics, is a book on apologetics, and Creation Answers book. And if you haven't signed up for InfoBytes, sign up. Every Friday we send out a mailing with our latest articles and information, and here are some, and there we are. I buzzed through the last few slides.
You guys got a lot of information, haven't you? All right, you store it somewhere. Thank you, Jim. We have let's take about 10-minute break, and we'll come back at 4:45 with our last presentation, all right? 10-minute break, thank you.
the supposed idea that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. I'm going to argue that the Earth is much younger than that. So here's an article that appeared in a very prominent theological, oh no, not this one, sorry, this is Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins says, if the history deniers who doubt the fact of evolution are ignorant of biology, those who think the world began less than 10,000 years ago are worse than ignorant. They are deluded to the point of perversity. So I just said to you that I don't believe that the Earth is millions, billions of years old. I believe the Earth was created 6,000 years ago. So Dawkins has called me quite the name here, hasn't he? He's called me ignorant and deluded to the point of perversity. So according to Dawkins, I'm evil. I want to present evidence that supports the claim that the world is only about 6,000 years old. And yet there are many Christians who don't accept that. For instance, in a prominent theological, Westminster Theological Journal, the authors there said, in the future, wrestling with geologically relevant texts, such as Genesis 1 to 11, evangelical scholars will have to face the implications of the massive geological data indicating the Earth is extremely old. So I can tell you that Davis Young has essentially ignored CMI's work because we're constantly countering the kind of stuff that he puts out, and he just ignores CMI's work. And we have geologists on staff. The Institute for Creation Research has Timothy Clary as a prominent geologist, and they just ignore it. So what difference does it make? Because young people ask questions like, well, could God have created the Earth over billions of years and allowed it to form on its own before he injected life into it? Well, that's a valid question, so we should be able to answer that question. Does the presence of fossils indicate an old Earth? Could billions of years have been fit between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2? That's called the gap theory, by the way. And isn't there lots of geological evidence? Davis Young says there is, that the Earth is billions of years old. Does the Bible actually tell us how old the Earth is? And it does. Can we propose a way to reconcile biblical account and the geological record? So those are questions that we want to address. So there are these Christians who are putting out these publications that they are arguing vociferously that the Earth must be very old. This one right here, The Biblical Case for an Old Earth, David Snook. I think that's published by Baker Bookhouse. I have the detail if you're interested. Here's Davis Young again, and The Bible Rocks in Time, Geologic Evidence for the Age of the Earth. And then this one right here, Understanding Science Theories of Origins. So these are put out by prominent evangelical publishing houses like Baker and Erdman's and those kinds of things, and they are arguing for an old Earth. The two on the left are reviewed on creation.com if you want to read the reviews. The one on the right was reviewed in the Journal of Creation. I don't think the article has been published on our website yet. But if the Earth is billions of years old, then we just can't trust the plain reading of Genesis 1 and 2 because God tells us what he did and we can't trust it. And so we need to fortify young people to trust the Bible. And I mentioned this morning that the consensus thinking of the Earth being very old is contrary to this statement in Genesis 1:23, where God says that everything he made was very good. And if there has been 65 million years of fossils being formed, and it's more than that, but that's since the dinosaurs went extinct, then we have evidence in the fossil record of death and suffering and disease and decay, and yet God declares it to be very good, because he only declares it to be very good after he's created Adam. So if Adam is a late creation in the horizon of God's creation scheme, then all of this is below the very good. And as I have mentioned often, I don't understand the word good then. It's that simple. So Adam's sin brought a curse into the world, decay. And Paul makes that clear in Romans 8:22. So why is it then that people believe in an old earth? Well, one reason they believe in an old earth is because the incredibly low odds of life as we know it coming into existence through chance processes if we don't have long ages. And we also admit, evolutionists admit, that they're not seeing evolutionary processes occurring in observable time. Stephen Jay Gould, a professor at Harvard, he made the statement that we don't observe evolution, and he created this approach, this called punctuated equilibrium. Basically, evolution occurred, but we don't see it because it occurs so fast in various points in history. So, but yeah, it occurred, but we just don't see it occur. So that's how they got around it. It's the old you can have your cake and eat it too phenomenon. So here's a quote from Popular Science magazine. Therefore, scientists counter that these principles are oversimplified. That is, the principles of calculating the odds, and inaccurate. And the physical evidence is irrefutably conclusive. For instance, evolution took place over an unimaginably long time period, enough that the seemingly improbable aspects of evolution become probable. So the reason they believe in an old earth is not because the evidence is there, it's because they need it for evolution. That's why at the root of it. So if you give enough time, the unimaginable becomes probable, or the improbable becomes probable, they claim. Evolution requires long ages to be even remotely possible, not because there's any evidence supporting either evolution or the old earth. So here are some basic assumptions that you have to make about unobserved history. Remember, no human was present, and so these, we're looking at things that nobody has given us a record of, other than God, by the way. So here's a sink. And I ask you, how long has it taken for the drip of the right-hand faucet to fill this sink? How long has it taken? Well, you don't know, because you don't know how rapid the drip is, and there are various things. What are the initial conditions? Was there a little water in the sink? Some? A lot? You don't know how... And this is the same thing if we apply it to radioisotopes. You don't know how much of a radioisotope was originally in the rock when it was formed. We'll look at that. So another thing, you don't know the constancy of the rate. Did somebody come and turn the faucet and tighten it for a little while? So you don't know if it's always been dripping at the same. And very few natural processes have constant rates. Very few. And we've only been measuring rates for about 500 years. The other thing you don't know is the degree of isolation. Maybe somebody pulled the plug for a while, put the plug back in. Maybe there was evaporation and it burning off some of the water. It's extremely difficult to isolate systems from their environment. So keep these three things in mind: initial consistency, constancy of rate, and degree of system isolation. So here's the question then. How long has Niagara Falls been cutting its gorge? Do we know the initial conditions? Do we? Possibly. When Lake Iroquois, after the glaciers were melting off, Lake Iroquois covered all of Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, and at some point the water started to drop below the edge of the Niagara Escarpment and started to erode. But was there a gorge there or not before that? We don't know. So we don't know the initial conditions. Is it a constant rate? In fact, no. The interesting thing is that when Lake Iroquois was melting and the glaciers were melting, a lot more water was running off the Niagara River than there is today. Second thing is, today, about half of the water coming down the Niagara River is diverted to generate electricity for Ontario. Half of the water is being diverted and going through big culverts, pipes, into the Beck generating plant. And is the system isolated? No, it is not isolated. because snowfall can add to different amount of moisture one year after another, and we just don't know if the system's isolated. But just assume, based on measurements, that it's been going back 1.5 meters per year. That's what the measurements, recent ones, have been showing. Then it would have only taken 4,000 to 7,000 years for the Niagara Gorge to form, from the edge of the Niagara Escarpment right at Lake Ontario to work its way back. 4 to 7,000 years. What does that support? It supports a world that's only 6,000 years, and it actually supports the Genesis flood 4,400 years ago, interestingly enough. Not billions of years. So let's apply that to radioisotopes, because this is the main stumbling block that people present for supposedly believing that the world is billions of years old. So various techniques are used. Uranium decays into lead, potassium to argon, rubidium to strontium, and then there's carbon-14 into nitrogen. These are the 4 primary ones that you hear about. So what are the assumed conditions we have? Do we know how much uranium or lead was in the initial rock when it was formed? We don't. We weren't there to see it. We don't know what the initials are. Is it a constant rate? There have been various arguments that decay rates change through time. We don't know. We've only been measuring them for a few hundred years. And is the system isolated? Actually, no. Uranium is water soluble, as an example. So it's not necessarily isolated. And potassium is water soluble, so changes could occur. Let me just deal with carbon-14 first, because I want to dismiss it. It cannot be used for measuring the age of the Earth. Carbon-14 is produced when cosmic rays hit the atmosphere, and they bumps up nitrogen into carbon-14, and the living entities absorb carbon-14. Now, the way that we get carbon-14 and animals get carbon-14 is by eating plant material. We don't ingest carbon-14 into our bodies. Carbon-14 is brought in when carbon dioxide is taken into plants, and through photosynthesis, they absorb carbon-14, and animals and humans ingest plant material, and we get carbon-14 into our bodies. And so, at death, when a plant, an animal, or a human die, the amount of carbon-14, no additional carbon-14 is added. Whatever it was is all there is, because that was formed during a living entity or eating the living plant. And so the carbon-14 then begins to decay into nitrogen. And so what they do is they take how much carbon-14 there is and how much is left, and they know how quickly it decays, and then they say, well, if there's this much carbon-14, it must be this old. But here's an example of 250 Vikings that died of an epidemic. It was probably SARS-CoV-2. Sorry, bad joke. They died of epidemic about 870 AD. But when we know that because of the Saxon raids, about 870 AD, but with carbon-14, it's dated at 300 years earlier. So there's a discrepancy there. So the method doesn't give a very reliable result. And so it does require calibration. But the method just cannot be used beyond 60,000 years. So carbon-14 is absorbed, and there's this much carbon-14. In 5,700 years, but let's make it simple, let's just say 6,000 years, there's going to be half as much. In another 6,000 years, we're down to a quarter. Then we're down to an eighth, 16th, 32nd to 64th, and within 60,000 years, you can't detect carbon-14. It's all gone. It's all decayed away. So it cannot be used to prove that the Earth is billions of years old, and it barely has any value to prove anything is older than 4,000 years, because the calibration becomes necessary. Look at this article from the Telegraph. It says that it says carbon dating might be wrong by 10,000 years and calibrating. So we can dismiss carbon-14. But when you get into these accepted dates versus selected dates, this is the problem. When they take a reading, if they like the result, they will use it. And one paper says, look, this whole thing is nothing but 13th century alchemy, and it all depends on which funny paper you read. Now, carbon-14 has value in the near term because it doesn't require as much calibration. And I point out in some of my presentations that coal has carbon-14 in it. Now, what does that tell us? If coal is in carbon-14 and all of the carbon-14 will be gone in 60,000 years, then what does that tell us about coal? It can't be more than 60,000 years old. Well, we believe that the coal was formed during the flood, not over millions of years. So in that sense, carbon-14 is beneficial to us because it indicates, if the presence of it indicates that there's still carbon-14, then it didn't get buried 65 million years ago or whatever. Carbon-14 can't be used to prove anything, really, let alone that the Earth is very old. So let's look at the other techniques. Uranium, lead, potassium, argon, and so on. Recent lava flows have been tested in labs, and they give old dates. Sunset Crater was based upon Aboriginal natives' history. The lava formed about 1065 AD, and the potassium-argon dating, hundreds of thousands of years. A lava flow in New Zealand destroyed trees about 300 years ago, and it's dated at half a million years. This one people may recognize. This is Mount Doom from the Lord of the Rings series, filmed in New Zealand. And lava flows in 1949, 1954, and 1975 are dated from 250,000 to 3.5 million years. And yet we know when these lava... Rocks from a volcano in Hawaii dated at 1800, but known to occur in 1800. 12 samples dated from 140 million to almost 3 billion years, with an average of 1.4 billion. And yet the lava was formed in 1800. Rock formed in 1980 with the explosion of Mount St. Helens. People witnessed it. The lava was formed, has been dated at 350,000 years using radiometric dating techniques. This is an interesting one. Wood was encased in lava, and you use the carbon-14 dating, and you get a date of 45,000 years, which means that it can't be very old because there's still carbon-14 in it. But the basalt rock that is around the wood is dated with the potassium argon at 45 million years. So which is right? Well, we know it's not the potassium argon dating because there's still carbon-14 in the wood. Recent volcanic activity in the Grand Canyon. One layer is dated 100 million years, and it's on top of sedimentary rock that is dated at 5 million years based on the index fossils. So you take the lava and you date it 100 million years, but it's on top of rocks that are dated at 5 million years because of their index fossils. The dating methods using radioactive isotopes are absolutely useless. They are plain and simply useless. And there is no objective independent measure in nature that can be used to demonstrate the Earth is old. Isotope ratios established when the igneous rock are formed are not measures of time. And for rocks with a known date, it doesn't work. I've just shown you a bunch of them, and I could give you many more examples. Here's another, Mount Stromboli, 1963, dated at 2.4 million years. Mount Etna, 1964, dated at 0.7 million years. It's endless, these examples. The method doesn't work. Rocks of an unknown age, though, the method is assumed to work. They just assume it's right, but no of these radioisotope methods give a true age for the age of the Earth. So, They say the Earth is old, and any contrary dates are dismissed. But this is unproven. The method can't be wrong, they say. But unreasonable dates are dismissed. This is arbitrary. I don't like the date, I'll get rid of it. Contrary evidence is dismissed as rare. This is rationalization, and it's false. Contrary dates are rejected as tainted. This is special pleading. Dating method cannot fail. That's blind-faced bias. Basic radiometric data is plagued with logic errors. And evolutionists can't accept that radiometric data is wrong because they can't believe that it could be faulty because they need deep time if they want to have evolution. I have both of these books here with me, and if you want to pursue this, either one is worth reading. Rocks Aren't Clocks and Thousands Not Billions. Or you can just go and get articles on creation.com. Now, does the Bible tell us how old the Earth? Yes, it does. Because in Genesis 5 and Genesis 11, we read a continuous chain of so-and-so gave birth to so-and-so at such and such an age. We can add it up. And we can get to Shem. And then the Bible tells us, and I have the Bible references there, but it's 390 years to Abram, and that's in Genesis 12:4. And then 130 years to Haran, and then 430 years to the Exodus, and the Bible references are there. And then the temple is constructed, and the division of the northern and southern kingdom, and the destruction of Jerusalem. And if you map it to a secular date of 586 BC, then you can just work back. So you can actually tie with these milestones, and you get back roughly to 4000 BC. Which makes the world roughly 6,000 years. Now, you can't be exact on this. Don't fall for this, because in the Genesis 5 and Genesis 11, the person gave birth during a year, but the son wasn't born on his birthday. So we can have up to a whole year in there. So if we took an average of half a year of the 10 generations, we'd have to have 5 years, just as an example. So we can't be exact, but it can give you a pretty good indication with these milestones. Paul, by the way, mentions the 430 years. I think it's in Galatians. Is it in Galatians? But it is, he mentions it as well. But these are the Bible references that tell you how old the earth is. God is the only one who gives us an objective measure for the age of the earth. Now, it is claimed that strata have been laid down over millions of years. These are sedimentary. You can't use radiometric dating techniques on sedimentary rock. It only works on igneous rock, where the isotopes are frozen in the rock. But it's false. Strata can be laid down almost instantaneously, as these polystrate trees show us, because you can have a layer of shale, and then a layer of sandstone, and a layer of coal, and this is done during the flood, and the trees go up through the various strata. The flood provides a much better explanation. Here we have coal. It's claimed that it takes, boy, there's quite a bit of coal there, isn't it, in those seams, and that's up in Alaska. The coal formation, it's claimed, takes a long time, but it's false. If you have good organic material, heat, and pressure, coal will form within a matter of weeks. Flood provides a much better explanation. Another claim is coal formed millions of years ago, but it's false, because I said coal samples, even at different depths, contain carbon-14. They can't have been formed millions of years ago, or the carbon-14 would be long gone. The claim that stalactites and stalagmites require millions of years. It's false. Here's a building, the Lincoln Memorial, and stalactites are starting to form. Here in the George Rogers Clark Monument, that column was formed since 1933. It doesn't take millions of years to form these. Here from National Geographic is a picture where a bat is being encased in the calcium, and the bat hasn't decayed away yet. It indicates that it's building up so fast. The flood provides a much better explanation. Is there any evidence at all that the world is not billions of years old? Well, one example is missing human remains. Just if you do the calculation of a couple has 2.25 children. I have never seen a quarter of a child before, but just 2.25 children. Steady state is considered to be 2.1 children per couple. So I've just taken it. If I do this at 2.25, in 60,000 years, the world would have 21 trillion people. So, if I go, you can go to this population calculator. I've given you the website there, and you slide them over. In 4,000 years, the world would have a population of 9 billion people if it was 2.1005 children per woman. And the world, in 4,400 years since the flood, had roughly 8 billion, 7.5, 9, somewhere in that, 8 billion. So that is a reproduction rate of 2.1005. Where are all the missing people? The flood ended 4,400 years ago, and the Bible's time scale works. Mitochondria DNA are the powerhouses of the cells. And we inherit our mitochondria DNA from our mothers. And we all have basically the same mitochondria DNA. Studies have been done on taking DNA samples where we know, like a hairbrush had a Russian princess's hair sample, and we know who her descendants are, and the American soldiers from the Civil War 150 years or so ago, and we have a hair sample. A mother may have taken a lock of her boy's hair before he went off to war. He came back and had children. We can compare the DNA. And Gibbons reports evolutionary studies led them to expect one mutation in 600 generations, one every 12,000 years. So they were stunned to find 10 base pair changes, which gave them a rate of one mutation every 40 generations, or one every 800 years. And what's happening here is mitochondria DNA mutation rate is too rapid to support millions, even hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, because there should be far more mutations. If I recall correctly from what I've read, there's about 800 mutations in mitochondria DNA across the entire human population. Not a lot. In the nuclear DNA, there are a lot more, but in the mitochondria DNA, it's very stable. So, the measured rate, and Gibbons reports, indicates that mankind's only been in our 6,000 years. But just to confirm this, studies have been done on other types of creatures, roundworms, water fleas, fruit flies, and baker's yeast, on their mitochondria DNA and the mutations. And every one of them indicates roughly 6,000 years, roughly. They all come to the same result. Now, that's uncanny. Like, what are the odds in a random universe of that occurring? But if life has all been created 6,000 years ago, then it makes good sense, doesn't it? So the predicted measured mitochondria DNA rate supports recent creation, not millions of years. I've mentioned genome decay in one of my presentations today already, but it's worth relooking at that. And I do have Sanford's book here on genetic infantry if you would like to pursue this. And mutations are accumulating in each generation at a rate of between 200 and 300 in every single generation. Now, not all the mutations are deleterious. Some are spelling mistakes that the DNA can still manufacture. Well, DNA doesn't manufacture, but the cell machinery taking the RNA template can manufacture the proteins successfully. God has built into DNA all kinds of error correction routines. But mutations are accumulating rapidly, and there are about 6,000 mutations in the human population right now, and they're accumulating, and Sanford predicts that in roughly 300 generations, the human population will go extinct. Well, we couldn't have been here for 10,000, 100,000 years, or too many generations would have gone by. We don't need to worry, though, because we know God's in control here, and my personal belief is Christ is going to return long before any of this manifests itself. Other examples, atmospheric helium. It is produced when radioactive isotopes decay. we know how much helium is in the atmosphere, and it's accumulated in about 2 million. It could, at known rates, accumulate in 2 million years. But that doesn't mean there was zero helium at the initial. God could have included helium. Remember, you don't know what the original proportions were. But all of it could have accumulated at current rates. Current saltiness of the oceans would have occurred in 60 million years. Probably a lot faster during the flood, because there was a lot of hot acidic water, and it was consuming the old continent, and it was washing all this salt into what is now the oceans. No, at the current rates, observed rates, the organic carbon that's in the oceans would have accumulated in 4,000 to 6,000 years. Makes great sense from the standpoint of the flood, doesn't it? Again, recent creation. Amber. You know, this is the classic one that's in Jurassic Park and that kind of thing, because this is where they supposedly get the DNA of the dinosaurs. Bacteria, fungi, yeast extracted from the abdomens of insects is still, it can germinate and it's still alive in one sense. But if the Earth were really very old, and if this was buried 65 million years ago, then all the functions should have long ago ceased. Better explanation is that the preservation in amber was done during the flood. There's something common stamped on the products that are in your refrigerator, your medicine cabinet, your pantry. And what is it? Something is stamped on products. It's a best before date. We know that organic materials decay, and they decay rapidly. Mary Schweitzer wrote of finding soft tissue in dinosaur bones, and she was ridiculed when she found this soft tissue, because they said it's impossible that there could be soft tissue, because the organic material and DNA would have long ago corroded and eroded away. And they said that she had tainted samples and so on. But we have in our database at least 50 research papers that have been published with dinosaur DNA, and about 100 other ones. And it's very difficult to explain how soft tissue has not decayed or fossilized. And so the Earth just can't be as old as evolutionists claim. The pressure in natural gas wells would have long ago dissipated through sedimentary rock. If the Earth were as old as evolutionists claim, the stone arches would have long ago decayed, because they're eroding at such a rapid rate. Better explanations, they were formed 4,400 years ago at the end of the flood. Stone continents would have completely eroded to flatness in less than 14 million years. And yet, geologists tell us, west is this way, right? Geologists tell us that those Rocky Mountains out there took 100 million years to form. Well, they would have eroded away 4 or 5 times in that period. The amount of erosion going into the oceans is putting about 27 billion tons of sediment, and about 1 billion of that tons is being subducted. The oceans would be completely full, and the world would be as flat as a billiard ball if the Earth were as old as evolutionists claim. The Earth is a big giant magnet, and the Earth's magnetic field is decaying, and it's decaying rapidly. In a 1,000-year period, it is decayed by 40%. In 1,000 years from now, there will be no magnetic field left on the Earth. The Earth can't be billions of years old. Now, how do evolutionists get around this one? They say, well, it must regenerate. Because the world is billions of years old, the magnetic field must regenerate. They have no empirical evidence to indicate that. Surtsey Island off of Iceland was formed by a volcano that erupted over a 4-year period in the 1960s. When you look at it today, it looks old, mature, rounded cobblestones on the beaches and sand and everything. It has the appearance of age, but it's not evidence of age. So let's take a thought experiment. Suppose we could travel back in time, and we are in Cana of Galilee, and a gentleman named Jesus is at a wedding, and his mother comes to him, and she says, we've run out of wine. And Jesus says, get me some big, large jars this size, filled them with water, and instantaneously it's the best wine that had ever existed. How old is the wine? If you took a wine specialist, he would taste it and say, wow, you know, those grapes took time to grow, and then you had to ferment them, and you aged it, but it was created a few seconds ago. On the shores of the Sea of Galilee, Jesus takes a few loaves of bread and a few fish, and he breaks them, and he starts to distribute them. You get a baker and with one of those pieces, well, how old is that bread? And he says, well, it was baked 4 or 5 days ago. Jesus had just created it instantaneously. So assumed age is not necessarily true age. And so when God created the world, he created it with fully formed entities. And it has a superficial appearance of age, of processes. But God tells us what he did. He created a mature universe. Look at all the things that already were there that give the appearance of age. The continent had topsoil because it could hold trees. Plants bearing seed. Fruit trees bearing fruit that was ready to eat. It looked like it had to go through a process of growth. We have land with drainage systems. We're told that a river flowed out of the Garden of Eden and branched into 4 rivers. So land had drainage systems. They didn't carve. It was instantaneous. Stars were visible from the earth. Marine mammals were able to breathe in water. Birds were able to fly. They didn't have to get kicked out of nest. They flew instantly. Plants and animals existed in symbiotic relationships. Rocks had crystals in them. Rocks had a mixture of radioactive elements. And Adam and Eve were created as adults, and they were able to speak and to think. All of this would give the appearance of age, but God created a functionally mature creation. And all that he created was very good, and it was all there to support human life. And so man's theories for explaining the origin and the age of the earth are filled with all kinds of problems. And we either accept what God said, that he created a functionally mature world into which man could live, or we're left with all kinds of conflicting culture. And the Bible, Jesus, declares to us that at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. And so we have creation at the beginning, and mankind has been on, by the time Jesus is talking, about 4,000 years in 30 AD, and then today we're about 6,000 years, 2,000 years before Christ. But, so we have that, mankind present at the beginning. The evolutionist timeline says the alleged Big Bang about 13.8 billion years. The Earth was formed about 4.5 billion years. Modern humans arrive around 200,000 years, and mankind is present only at the end. So which is right? Are we going to trust what Jesus says? The evidence for a young Earth is found in extra-biblical accounts that have no direct connection with the Hebrew Scriptures. The Irish Chronicles say that Ireland was colonized in mapped to what is 1444 BC. They didn't have that expression in the 2520th year since creation. The Saxon Chronicles date creation about 5200 BC. So both of these fit within the rough order of magnitude of 4000 BC, independent of the Genesis account. So I have all kinds of resources here at the table. Deep Time Deception, the Answers book, and creation.com. The videos, I may not have the Young Earth here, but Russell Humphrey's video and this one, Radioactive Dating. If you're interested in watching a video on that, it'll explain what I have explained here. And Jim Mason is one of our PhD physicists in our Canadian CMI operation. He lives in Hamilton, and he's explaining this. And so this is available to you. We have the Genesis account written by Dr. Sephardi, who is a chemist, and he's got a good background in theology. We have a children's pack Creation Answers for Kids, Explorers. We have all kinds of amazing material on the table, and at some point we'll open that up, and you can go and browse it. And now, I just want to make a point. We make no money when we sell these books. It's not a profit for us. We try to put it as cheap as we can possibly put it because we need to get that material into your hands. So we break even on this material, but it costs a lot of money to manufacture them and ship them and all that kind of stuff, right? So we don't pay our authors for it. If we could give it away for free, we would, but we can't. So it's not a business for us. So don't think of this as, well, you're going to make a lot of money on this. No, we don't make it. We're trying to get that information to reinforce your faith. Now, I believe we can go to questions now, right? Yeah. So I can take some questions, but we'll have to manage this because if people are streaming, we have to let them hear the questions with the microphone. And it doesn't have to be necessarily on these two topics, but let's try to keep it to questions related to Genesis, basically.
Can I have this one just a second? As you discussed, I want to ask you, Creation Ministries International has a policy. They're not answering questions about COVID and vaccinations, all right? This is a very divisive topic, so that's their policy,
yeah,
right?
We have been told not to talk about.
Yeah, they're not talking in public
COVID,
about it.
From the standpoint of and from vaccines or anything like that.
So just
don't even get into those topics, because I
thank you. Just wanted to make sure because I know somebody's going to ask that question. So, all right, questions. We're going to hold the microphone for you, so that not everybody's touching the microphone. So I'll come.
You don't want to cause any wars in congregations.
No, I don't. So go ahead.
So in the second last presentation, you were showing again I guess I'll call it the evolutionary sort of tree.
Yes.
And also you were talking about genetic diversification.
Yes.
And
wait a minute, genetic diversification?
Genetic
I said the genome has a broad spectrum of availability into which natural selection allows different subpopulations to form.
Right. So I guess trying to get to my question is, I'm wondering if because what I saw, it seemed just the picture on the slide seemed to indicate that that same evolutionary tree would be acceptable from a creationist point of view, but I'm wondering if that evolutionary tree from a creationist point of view could essentially be turned upside down, in that there used to be much more genetic diversification, and we are dealing with less in today's world than what God essentially may have created initially. Because I know you were talking about how
well, you're certainly correct in that, because there's been die-off of a lot of species and complete kinds.
Right, yeah.
No question about that. And they continue to go extinct. But I'm going to call the tree up. Oops. You have a very interesting point. I'll just call up the tree here. Because interesting enough, I presented, how come it's not opening here? Here we go. I presented a tree also from a creationist viewpoint. Let's see if I can find it. So that was right here. I actually presented a tree from a creationist standpoint. You see the bottom of this slide right here. So that's a tree right there, isn't it? Each one of them is a tree. But the difference is that as we're going up the bottom tree there, less genetic information. It's losing genetic information. In the evolutionary tree, the whole point was we're adding genetic information. As we go from a single cell to a complex organisms, we're adding genetic information. In this tree, we have a lot of genetic information in the original kinds, and as they speciate, they have less genetic information. So both are trees, but they're exactly the opposite of one another.
Oh, I totally get what you're saying in that regard. I'm wondering if because, the fact that there were dinosaurs and the size of animals and the perfect sort of means that God created were there available for God's creation, and things would have been just, I don't know how to put it, but the prominence of availability of food and nutrients for the creatures and the size of the creatures and so forth. I'm just wondering if there would have been more creatures. So in other words, could that tree essentially in this regard be turned upside down to indicate that there was much more diversification and we're kind of dwindling down to...
I'm absolutely convinced you're right on that.
Yeah.
After the initial kinds were created, even irrespective of Adam's sin, they had a broad genetic capability, and they diversified into the pre-flood world in amazing ways. Some of those we may find in the fossil, and we don't see examples today, right? But after the flood, Noah had taken kinds into the ark, and whatever pairs were brought to Noah had enough of the genetic information. They may not have been identical to the original kind, but they had enough genetic information that there's an explosion again after the flood. But we find an amazing stasis. Alligators before the flood in the fossil record, and alligators after the flood. Dolphins before the flood, dolphins after the flood, and on and on and on. There's a lot of stasis too. So, but there may have been varieties of animals before the flood that have never materialized after the flood at all.
Thank you.
Even within the same kind, right?
All right,
yeah.
We have a question here.
Sorry, I'm just going to slowly work my way up to the question. So based on the Genesis, chapter 1, and this says, God put vault in between water, so separates from above and under, right? So that means the vault is called sky. Right. So
the vault is called
sky.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So when NASA and all those countries projects sending rockets to the space, so when they leave this vault, would it possibly enter into this water? And the picture they're taking of the Earth, because besides those departments went there and took the picture and tell us the Earth looks a sphere. But I also watch a lot of video and showing strong evidence that a lot of detail that doesn't support the theory of that the Earth is a sphere shape. So do you guys have any studies or any digging into this type of topic regarding whether the Earth is a flat or Earth is a sphere?
Do you want me to use that presentation? Because I have it ready.
Yeah, how long it is?
15 slides or so.
All right, so it's about the flat Earth theory.
Do you want me to go that route?
Absolutely, that's a big one right now, flat Earth theory
All
stuff.
right.
So let's listen to this one. I was going to ask you that question anyway, so go ahead.
All right. Oh, I've got to find it. It's here. So I'm going to ask the question, is it a sphere or is it flat? Right? So I have to open it here. In the scriptures, there's over 200 verses that supposedly support the idea that the earth is flat. And one of them is from Daniel, for example. The tree grew and became strong, and its top reached to heaven. It was visible to the whole end of the whole earth. So if we have a flat earth, then we can see the tree everywhere, right? So these are examples. So as it's been pointed out, however, this is a dream. It's not physical evidence, and it's a dream of a pagan king. So keep that in mind. And it's not teaching about cosmology because it's in a dream. And here's another example. Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile, and behold, these came up, and so on. Well, you know this story out of Genesis 41. And 7 plump cows, 7 years, 7 lean, 7 years of famine. And that's often used to give the support of a flat earth. The devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world in their glory. Well, how could he see all the kingdoms of the world from a mountain if the earth wasn't flat? But it's interesting. Luke says it's slightly different. The devil took him up and showed him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time. Slightly different. So it may have been that he literally took him around the world in a moment of time, because the devil is a supernatural being. He's not a god, but he's a supernatural being. So, but there are verses that talk about the earth being, in the Bible, a sphere. It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them like a tent. And so you can read about this if you're interested. thecreation.com, Isaiah 40:22, circle sphere. Just type in Isaiah circle sphere into our website, and you'll get that article. So some of the evidence that indicates that the earth is a globe, and what they originally, when the sails are coming up with the horizon, it indicates that you're coming over a horizon. And Eratosthenes is an interesting fellow. He lived 200 years before Christ, and they had maps of the world at that point. And what he did was a very interesting thing. He knew the distance between 2 cities in Egypt, and he knew that at noon on a particular day, the sun would go right down the well, and he knew the distance, and he used geometry to calculate the circumference of the earth. And this is 200 years before Christ. And his calculation was incredibly accurate. Throughout history, people have understood that the earth is a globe. And this is on the Reckoning of Time, written in the 8 by Venerable Bede. We call the earth a globe because in all things are included in the outline, the earth's circumference will represent the figure of a perfect globe. And so from the Bible, these people understood that the earth was a globe. Here, Thomas Aquinas, writing in the 13th century, talks about it being a globe and talks about eclipses. And you'll notice that Byzantine emperors and Charlemagne and Henry III, they all carry this globe because of the concept of dominion over them. Now, this is the one you were talking about, making observations from space and seeing that the earth is in a globe, and even there's an eclipse of it. So here's some observations that confirm the earth is a globe. I forget this group, they flew non-stop around the world, and they were the first non-stop flight. And they just kept going straight, and they came right back to where they'd started. So they'd gone right around in a circle, non-stop. And I love this example here, because this is the CN Tower in Toronto. And when you're looking across Lake Ontario, the curve of the earth hides 184 meters of the CN Tower, because the curvature of the earth hides the bottom of the CN Tower. But you can only see the top part of the CN Tower because it's below the horizon, which indicates that you're looking at a curve. Do you follow that? And of course, I'm from Toronto, and so I like this example. And the stars orbit counterclockwise around the north celestial pole, but they rotate the opposite direction in the south. So if you had a flat earth, the stars should be rotating this direction. But if you have a globe and it's spinning this way, then the stars are going to spin the opposite directions. And so from the north celestial pole and the south celestial pole, they spin in opposite directions. And the stars in the constellation of we don't see this, the Southern Cross is in a different hemisphere. We also have time zones indicate that the Earth is a globe, because actually, do you know an easy way to know how fast the Earth is spinning is a time zone. How much time is in a time zone? 1 hour, right? Okay? And how big is a time zone? Like how far is a time zone? It's roughly 1,000 miles, roughly. 1,000 miles, roughly. And you can actually calculate that on it. But Jesus affirmed the existence of time zones. I tell you that in that night there will be two in one bed. One will be taken and the other left. There will be two women grinding together. One will be taken and the other left. Then, in a slightly different version in Matthew, then two men will be in the field, one will be taken and one left. Two women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one left. So what this actually affirms is that in some cases there's people in bed, and in other cases there's people working, which indicates that there are time zones. Now, he didn't call them time zones, but the existence of that. And the Flat Earth Society attempts to redefine physics. They attempt to redefine it. For example, they take the Coriolis effect, which appears to be a fictitious effect, but it's not. It appears to be a fictitious effect that is not and has never been properly demonstrated with experimental evidence. But the Coriolis effect, it is actually the currents on the Earth. And the currents flow in the northern hemisphere differently. It's not an actual force, is what we should say. But the currents flow in a different direction in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere because the Earth is spinning, and you see the Coriolis effect above the equator and below it. Air currents are pushed to the right above the equator, and to the south, they're pushed to the left. And what the Flat Earth Society does is they attempt to redefine this completely. Let me see if I can give you the quotations here. This is from the forum TFS, the Flat Earth Society org, in 2021, July 13. The Flat Earth movement has always demonstrated a strong deist movement. The clockwork universe are a good starting point for your understanding. So they basically say, they don't say unequivocally, but they basically say if you want to believe in a flat earth, you have to believe that God isn't actively involved in the universe. It's not absolute. Here's another one. Most flat earthers I've spoken to on the subject are atheists or agnostics, as am I. Whenever a poll is run on this subject, the results are generally pointing toward non-religious worldviews. So the people who are pushing flat earth are basically not Christians, basically. Religion is used to control the masses. Religion is perverts. I quoted it exactly, so they must have typed it. I didn't type it wrong. I just cut and paste. So religion is perverts you forever for even thinking, using common sense. Flat earth is the truth. So these are the kinds of comments you read on that forum when I went on July the 13th. So just the conclusions. The Bible doesn't teach flat earth. The church didn't teach it and doesn't teach it. It is scientifically absurd because the flat earth actually tries to change the basic concept of physics. Leading promoters today are not Christians, and the earth is a spinning globe, not a flat disk. So, I mean, I haven't gone into a lot of evidence here. I was just giving our view from Creation Ministries International.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So,
unfortunately, there is a lot of actually Christians these days that believe flat earth theory as well.
I'm afraid
it's not just outside of the church anymore.
You can read a lot of stuff on the internet, can't you?
Yeah, you can read a lot of stuff on the internet, and unfortunately it becomes a problem in the church as well. So, but I think you have given us some just little nuggets here to kind of stimulate our thinking as to, you know...
to at least think about.
Yeah, just to think about this debate. All right, let's take a few more questions. If you want to ask a question, it would be good for you to come down here, not to be on the balcony.
You're going to give me another good nugget of
All right.
correction? I'd appreciate it.
Wait a second. Are you asking one on the... Okay, short, quick questions. We have about 15 minutes left.
Plankton are living creatures that die when whales eat them. How does that fit with no death before Adam?
I can't hear you.
Okay.
Can you repeat the question after he says it?
Plankton are living creatures that die when whales eat them. How does that fit with no death before Adam?
Plankton.
Oh. So eating plants.
Plankton.
Plankton.
Whales eat plankton?
Plankton. Like, you mean what you see growing in water?
Those microscopic animals, plankton. In whales eat that. It's not plants, it's animals.
So I'm not sure I'm going to answer your question correctly, but let me try something here. Death before Adam is, and the death that Adam introduced is the death of what are called nefesh kaya, living creatures. The ESV is pretty consistent in translating it as either living creature or living creatures, nefesh kaya. There are forms of life that are not living creatures. Plants are included in that because God says to man and to animals that they could eat plants. They are not living creatures. And so when you have plants and bacteria and viruses and possibly insects, they are basically organic robots. And when you disassemble a robot, you're not killing it. It's not death. It is eating. When Adam ate a banana and consumed it, he's decomposing organic molecules, but it's not killing anything. It's just like taking an organic compound apart. When he threw the banana peel on the compost pile and it would start to decompose, it is similar to rain clouds dumping their rain. It's organic molecules, but it's not living by God's definition. By God's definition, it has to be nefesh kaya. God breathed into animals and into man a soul.
All right.
Creatures, yeah, living creatures. Nefesh
Terry,
kaya.
you're next.
Yeah. There was giants on the earth, right? It says that in Genesis. I was asking this question to you earlier. There was giants
There were
on
what?
the earth. Giants on the earth.
Giants.
And then also when Israel went into Canaan after,
There were giants.
there was giants. So why is there such a discrepancy? Like you're talking DNA and everything else. I've often wondered why there's such a difference there. And also, I was going to tell you another thing about Australia. I know this is going to sound crazy, but did you know the toilet goes the opposite way?
So let's just deal with the giant
Okay, I
question.
know, but I just thought I'd throw that at you.
I said one question at a time only. All right.
That wasn't a question, that was a statement.
Yeah. So God tells us that there were giants, and he tells us, for instance, how tall Goliath was, right? If I recall, he was about 9 feet tall, if I recall. But there's nothing that's inconsistent with the availability of genetic information to accept, like, there's nothing contradictory to a biblical view on this. And we see that before the flood, there were some very large creatures, like the Brontosaurus, the Dragnotus. And so some of the environmental conditions before the flood may have been much more salubrious in terms of producing larger creatures before the flood. After the flood, there may have been changes, just like after Adam's sin, there were changes. It's possible that after the flood, there were changes again, and there's sizes of animals, the environment may not be conducive. Now, it doesn't mean that there can't be Goliaths and those giants, but there are none today, but we're told that there were. There's nothing contradictory to anything that I have said to allow the existence of giants. Right? So we will go for about 5 more minutes until the top of the hour. Is that okay?
Yeah, 10 minutes until...
10 minutes. Yes, 10. I didn't look at my watch correct. 10 minutes.
I'm just trying to recall, you were saying earlier that when women are, zygotes are forming in pregnancy at an early stage, if they're at a high altitude, the environment is actually affecting the epigenetics and the manifestation of switches turning on and off different things that genetic information is going to translate into the phenotype and create an expression. And so the environment in the Bible talks about how the sins of the forefathers will continue into the third and fourth generation. And so it seems like our choices and our environment, our actions, they actually change our genes into becoming more and more.
So they don't change our genes. The epigenetic, the information is there in the gene, but epigenetic triggers can affect different phenomena out of that, because the genes can produce different things depending on what signals come in.
That's essentially what Darwin was seeing with the finches in his kind of expression, a local area isolated from other things, and being able to demonstrate.
Yeah.
So if we were talking about a lot of things with the food types we're eating, and different like Monsanto and genetic modified corn and everything. So do you feel that the input of these human inputs into our food source actually can change the outcome of our health, the strength of our resilience and different things?
Absolutely. So let's look at a positive example and then a negative example. If you look at, when I've gone to the Royal Ontario Museum and I've looked at the armor, suits of armor, obviously men in the Middle Ages were smaller than they are today, right? There are no 6-foot suits of armor. They're all small. Why is that? Well, their diets were worse, so on. In fact, if you get people, say, the children of immigrants to Canada are often taller than their parents, because some of those cultures where they're coming from, they didn't have very good diets. But as soon as they get better diets, they revert back to the mean. And so the good diet. So that's a positive thing, right? In terms of you get good food, you grow better, no question. And the problem the other way around is when you have bad diets and you see the impact on it. For example, people that grow up eating a lot of carbohydrates, as an example, heavy carbohydrate diets, and their children end up being a lot of overweight. It's an environmental, and it may be that the epigenetic signals during the mother's pregnancy are actually affecting how that child is going to develop, because the diet is too high in carbs, not enough protein, not enough fat, too much carbs. And that's an example of very bad diet. And I'm sad to say, and a lot of people that are poor end up eating a lot more carbs. They get less protein and less fats, right, because they're more expensive. So you see the results of that in their children. Now, if those children, they end up having dietary problems themselves, but if they are given good nutrition, their children will not necessarily be bad, right?
All right, we have a question here.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
You said that mutation is negative.
Overwhelmingly, but there are some benign mutations.
Okay, so does that mean that when a cell is born, it begins to mutate and it becomes less effective for the purpose it was born?
So when a son is born, it has genetic...
And a cell.
A cell. Oh, okay.
Mutation.
I'm sorry. I thought you said son. A cell. So initially, when a baby's born, there are some defects already in its genetic code, right? But during that child's development, growing into adult and beyond, mutations continue to occur. Now, some of those don't make it into the sperm, and they don't make it into the ova. So they don't end up being inherited, but they cause problems to that individual. Cancer is an example. That's mutations that destroy a person. Do you follow what I'm saying there? But it's not inherited.
But what happens over time with the mutation?
With the mutations, it destroys the cells in the entity. Runaway mutations destroy cells and they destroy the entity in which those cells are. But the ones that, if a mutation occurs in a woman's egg or it occurs in sperm, it could be inherited. Could be. And it will carry through. But if it occurs after the infant is born, those mutations could kill a person. Cancer is an example. But they won't be inherited.
All right, next question.
Okay, my question is about the dating, the carbon-14. So we can't use that dating method because it can't be more than 60,000 years, right? So
Roughly.
let's say we got a coal and it has carbon-14, then, it means these Earth is not more than 60,000, which is good, but then what I don't understand is this Earth is still 6,000, so what about this 60,000 years? So it is still, maybe not a good method to use carbon-14.
So if I date something with carbon-14 and I say it's 45,000 years, you have to go back to the point I made that we don't know how much original carbon-14 versus nitrogen versus standard carbon were there in the original mix, because cosmic rays could have been variable and changing the amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere. We don't know what the original mix was. That's a problem. We also don't know that the rate has been constant, but we'll assume it has been. Okay? But the biggest problem is we don't know how much of the ratios were at the beginning. We just don't know that. And so 3,000 years ago, just picking a number, the cosmic rays may have been quite different than they are now. They may have been. And so we may have more or less carbon-14 today than we did 3,000 years ago. We don't know because we weren't there to measure it. So the dating is a problem. You can't, the shorter the time span, the more reasonable carbon-14 is. But if you push it out beyond, say, 4,000 years, it starts to become defective and you need to calibrate it and it's not very useful. But if you were trying to date something, say, a body you found in a house and you wanted to date it with carbon-14 and you wanted to use it for forensic science, criminal investigation, carbon-14 might be helpful in that case because it could give you an indication of when the death occurred. Do you follow? Because the moment a death occurs, no new carbon-14 is added, and if you read the carbon-14, it could tell you, well, that death occurred within 5 years or 10 years, a mummified, you find it in a wall or something. Carbon-14 could be useful in that. But the further back you go, the example I gave of the Vikings, we know that they were buried about 810 AD, if I remember the exact date, but the carbon-14 dates them 300 years earlier, older. So the further back you go, the less reliable carbon-14 becomes. All right?
Okay. All right, this is the last question. It's 2 minutes.
It better be a good one.
All right, Ivan, I'll hold you the microphone.
Thank you. So Genesis 1:1 says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness," and so on and so on.
Yeah.
Okay, so is it possible that the earth is a giant piece of rock?
A giant piece of rock? A rock?
Inanimate matter.
Yeah.
Was old or is old, but life as we know it is
okay.
Is young.
So that is what is presented as what is called the gap theory. Yeah. That God created the earth and the universe billions of years ago, and then he started to form life on the earth. That's called the gap theory. I'm not going to take the time right now to refute that, but on our website, if you just go in and type in search on gap theory, you'll get all kinds of interesting explanations. But I will tell you simply that God says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and then there was light, and there was evening and morning. The first day. So he did all that in the first day. So if we just take the plain sense of Genesis 1, this is what he did the first day. And then certain things occurred, and there was a second day. And some things occurred, there was a third day. So if we just take the plain sense, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth, and then he said, let there be light, and so on. And then there was evening and morning, the first day. So I just don't think, a simple answer, gap theory doesn't work.
But it doesn't violate the plan of redemption. Like
okay, so I haven't given you any evidence that the universe is not 13.8 billion years. Mm-hmm. That's another whole presentation. So you have me back another time, and I'll do the universe one.
Okay.
Okay, but the universe is not 13.8 billion years old. It's also 6,000 years old, the entire universe, and there's a huge amount of evidence to support this.
Thank you. All right, food for thought, all right? I know we're not going to solve all the scientific things tonight. There's a lot of stuff to think about. So just wanted to say a big thank you to Jim. Yeah. You can put your hands together for him, He did great. Thank you, Jim. I appreciate it. Really enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed it as well. Stick around. He's going to be in the gym, so auditorium. As you come out of Sanctuary, go straight. We have their tables set up with a lot of materials, good material. He already showed it to you, and he will be there and talk to you, and you can purchase some material. So I'd like to just have a word of prayer as we close tonight, and then we'll dismiss and go into the auditorium. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your blessings. We thank you for this day that you have blessed us with. And thank you for this opportunity that we could have Jim here with us and this day. And he was speaking to us about creation, biblical creation, Lord. There's a lot of things for us to think, and I pray that you will give us the wisdom and you will guide us with your divine wisdom through this, because there is a lot of arguments around in the world, but help us, Lord, to stand true on the Word of God, and help us to always develop and grow in our understanding of you and of the universe and how you created everything, Lord. So thank you once again for Jim and for the Creation Ministries International. I pray a special blessing on that in this ministry as they travel all around Canada, around the world, and present this truth. So be with us as we dismiss tonight. We pray all these things in the name of Jesus. Amen. Thank you once again. God bless you, and we'll see you there in our auditorium.